The door did not slam. That was the part Amos Ferris would remember longest. It simply closed, quietly, the way a door closes when someone on the other side has already decided the conversation is finished. Frost lay thick across the yard that morning, the kind that outlines every blade of grass like a line drawn in chalk. 7-year-old Nora stood beside the wagon wheel, holding a rag doll with one arm and her father's coat sleeve with the other, watching her breath disappear into the cold. They had 11 days before the first heavy snow. Somewhere between 8 and 10 of those days, depending on the wind, before the roads up the valley would close for good. No relative was waiting, no spare room, no borrowed barn, no cousin with room enough for 2 more mouths. What Amos had instead was a strip of land nobody in the valley wanted, a slope of broken limestone above the tree line that every family had walked past for 2 generations without once thinking to stop. Hollis Cray, who had trapped that mountain longer than anyone alive, put it plainly when he heard where Amos was headed. "That rock has come down before," he said. "More than once." He was not being cruel. He had seen it happen. Amos did not argue with him. He only unrolled a length of wood, notched and worn smooth by his father's hands, and began walking the base of the mountain, measuring a gap in the stone the width of a doorway. By nightfall, smoke would tell him something he did not expect. By the second week, a dog's nose would find what no man had noticed, and before the valley's coldest night arrived, the people who had warned him to stay away would be the ones climbing the slope to see what he had done. But that was still ahead of him. That morning, all Amos Ferris had was a measuring stick, a daughter who trusted him more than she should have, and a crack in the mountain that everyone else had learned to walk past. The wagon groaned up the last stretch of the valley road, wheels catching on frost-heaved ruts that would be frozen solid within the week. Amos walked beside it rather than ride, partly to spare the mule and partly because sitting still gave him too much time to think about the house behind him, the one that was no longer his to think about at all. Nora rode inside wrapped in a quilt that had belonged to her mother, humming a tune with no clear beginning or end. She did not yet understand that they were not visiting the mountain. They were moving to it. The landlord had given him fair warning, in the way landlords give fair warning, which is to say enough time to be legal and not nearly enough time to be kind. A poor harvest, 2 seasons running, had emptied whatever goodwill the arrangement once carried. Amos did not blame the man entirely. He blamed the weather more, and himself a little, and mostly he tried not to spend energy on blame at all, since blame did not build shelter. What he had left, after settling what he owed, was a wagon, a mule, $17, a crate of tools that included a hand drill, a maul, and a chisel worn thin from his years, shaping foundation stone for other men's barns, and 40 acres of mountainside that nobody in 3 counties had bothered to farm, fence, or even walk across in living memory. The land had come to him almost as an afterthought, a parcel folded into a debt settlement nobody expected to collect on, steep, rocky, useless for planting, and marked on a county survey simply as broken ground. He had seen it once, years before, while hunting with his father. He remembered a dark seam low in the rock face, wide enough to duck into, that his father had called a good place to wait out rain and nothing more. Now it was the only roof he owned. Nora leaned out from beneath the quilt as the wagon crested the final rise, and the mountain came into view properly for the first time. Gray stone streaked with old, rust-colored mineral lines, a scattering of stunted pine clinging to whatever soil the wind had left behind. "Is that our new house?" she asked. Amos looked at the slope for a long moment before answering. "It's going to be," he said, and hoped it was closer to true than he felt. Behind them, 11 days remained before the valley's first heavy snow. Ahead of them was a mountain that had never once in anyone's memory been asked to hold a family through winter. The seam in the rock was larger than Amos remembered and colder than he expected, a mouth of stone, perhaps 12 feet wide, narrowing back into shadow he could not yet measure. Cold air rolled out of it steadily, the way it does from any deep hollow in earth or rock, a breath that never seemed to stop. He stood at the opening with Nora's hand in his and did the arithmetic that every frontier household eventually does when the ground itself becomes the only asset left. No lumber to buy. No neighbor's barn raising to call in favors from. No time to fell, season, and shape enough timber for a proper cabin before the roads closed. What he did have was stone in more supply than any man could want, and a crack in the mountain that already blocked wind on 3 sides. He walked the outer face of the opening first, running a bare hand along the rock, the way he once checked foundation stone before setting a barn sill on it, feeling for looseness, for the kind of hairline seam that widens under frost. Hollis Cray had not been wrong to warn him. Rock did fail. Rock had failed on this mountain before, according to old stories passed between hunters, and Amos intended to respect that rather than dismiss it. But failure in rock, he reasoned, rarely came without warning, the way failure in a man rarely does either. A stone that had held its shape through 100 winters was not the same as a stone balanced loose on a ledge. He spent the first half day doing nothing anyone in the valley would have called building. He only looked. He tapped stone with the flat of his maul, listening for the difference between a solid ring and a hollow one. He watched where morning frost melted first and where it lingered, since lingering frost often marked damp ground beneath, ground that would need drainage before anything else. Nora sat nearby on an overturned crate, wrapped in her mother's quilt, watching her father talk to a mountain as though it might answer him. By evening, he had marked the boundary of what he intended to close in with a shallow line scratched into the dirt, roughly 18 feet across at the mouth, narrowing toward the back. He pulled the measuring stick from his coat, the one his own father had notched decades earlier, building foundations no one in this valley remembered anymore, and laid it against the opening. 10 days now remained. The stick would need to earn its keep sooner than either of them expected. Word travels faster in a small valley than weather does, and by the 3rd day, most families within riding distance knew exactly where Amos Ferris had taken his daughter. Few of them said it kindly. It was Hollis Cray who rode up first, not out of cruelty, but out of something closer to obligation. A man who trapped that mountain every winter for over 20 years does not stay silent while a neighbor moves his child into a hole in the rock without at least saying his piece. You know that face has come down before, Hollis said, standing at a respectful distance from the opening, eyes moving along the stone above it the way a man reads weather in clouds. Not this exact spot, but close enough. Lost a good dog to a rockfall 2 ridges over, spring before last. Amos did not dismiss him. He had learned, working other men's foundations for a decade, that the fastest way to build something that failed was to stop listening to people who had watched the ground longer than you had. Show me where, Amos said. Hollis did, walking the slope with him for the better part of an hour, pointing out fracture lines in nearby outcrops, explaining how frost worked its way into stone the same patient way it worked into a man's joints, prying wider each winter until something finally gave. What Hollis could not explain because he had never had reason to look closely at this particular seam was why this stretch of rock sat differently than the ones that had failed. The layers here ran in thick, even bands, tilted back into the mountain rather than jutting out over open air. It was the kind of detail a trapper walking past at a distance would never have cause to notice, and the kind of detail a man who had spent years reading foundation stone would. Amos did not argue the danger away entirely, because some of it was real, and pretending otherwise would have been foolish. He agreed to leave the deepest back portion of the seam untouched, unsupported by any wall, in case the stone above it ever did decide to move. He would build forward near the mouth, where the rock ran solid and the risk was smallest. Hollis rode off unconvinced, but no longer arguing, which on the frontier passed for a kind of respect. Others were less generous. A rancher's wife, meeting Amos at the trading post 2 days later, asked if he intended to raise Nora like a badger, and did not wait for an answer before turning away. Amos said nothing back. He had 9 days left and no time to spend defending a wall that did not exist yet. The work began in earnest on the 4th morning, and it looked, to anyone passing on the ridge trail above, less like a home taking shape and less like a man losing a fight with a mountain that had no intention of being tamed. Amos worked stone the way he had learned building barn foundations, choosing each piece for how it would sit rather than how it looked, favoring flat beds over pleasing shapes. He built dry without mortar, since he had none to spare and no time to mix what he did not have. A dry stone wall laid correctly relies on weight and friction rather than paste to hold itself together, each stone locking against its neighbors the way a puzzle locks rather than the way glue does. He worked from the outside in, setting the largest stones at the base, tapering the wall inward slightly as it rose, a shape he had watched old foundation men on his childhood farm call battering, though none of them had ever explained why, beyond saying that a wall built straight up was a wall waiting for an excuse to fall down. Nora helped as much as a 7-year-old reasonably could, sorting smaller stones by size into piles, fetching water from the spring below, and narrating the entire process to Bess, the family's aging hound, who had followed them up from the old farm and now spent most of her days curled near whatever patch of sun the mountain offered. The measuring stick came out constantly, checking the wall's rise against itself, keeping each course level enough that weight distributed evenly rather than concentrating on one weak point. Amos left a gap near the center for a doorway, framing it temporarily with two upright timbers salvaged from the wagon's spare boards, and a second, smaller gap, higher up, on instinct, more than plan, in case smoke from any future fire needed somewhere to go besides straight into their faces. By the end of the fourth day, the wall stood chest high across most of its length, a rough half-circle of stacked gray stone, sealing the mouth of the cave against the open slope beyond. It was not beautiful. It leaned in places Amos was not entirely satisfied with. But it stood, and standing on a mountain that gave you nothing for free, felt like the first real proof that this might not end the way half the valley expected it to. That night, for the first time, Amos allowed himself to light a fire inside. The fire started small, built from dry pine needles and split kindling Amos had gathered along the tree line, before the cold set in, fully. For a few minutes, it burned exactly as any fire should, warm light spreading across the rough stone walls, Nora's face glowing orange as she held her hands toward it. Then the smoke stopped rising, the way smoke was supposed to rise. Instead of drawn upward and out through the gap Amos had left high in the wall, it began pooling near the ceiling of the cave, thickening, rolling back down into the space where they sat. Within minutes, the air had turned sharp and stinging, and Nora began coughing, small dry coughs that quickly grew worse. Amos moved fast, half carrying her toward the doorway, pulling the wagon canvas aside to let cold night air rush in. Both of them gulping it in relief, while the fire behind them continued to fill the cave with gray haze. Bess barked at the doorway the entire time, ears back, refusing to go near the smoke herself, which Amos would remember later, though that night he had no attention left to spare for a dog's instincts. Outside, kneeling in the frost with his daughter, coffin against his shoulder, Amos allowed himself, for the first time since the wagon left the old farm, something close to doubt. The wall held. The stone worked exactly as he had hoped, but a home that could not safely hold a fire was not a home at all, in a country where the difference between warmth and frozen was often a matter of hours, not days. He sat outside long after Nora's breathing steadied, staring at the thin gap he had left in the wall for smoke to escape, trying to understand why cold air seemed willing to pour in through the doorway. But smoke refused to leave through the opening meant for it. He did not yet have an answer. What he had was 7 days left before the valley's first heavy snow. A daughter who had just coughed herself raw inside the shelter meant to protect her, and a wall that clearly needed to be smarter than it currently was. He did not sleep well that night. Neither, from the sound of it, did the mountain, wind working steadily along the outer rock face as though testing the new stone for weakness. It was Bess who found it 3 mornings later, and not because anyone had asked her to. Amos had spent those 3 days rebuilding the wall's upper gap twice, widening it, angling it, moving it to different points along the stone, with only marginal improvement each time. Smoke still lingered longer than it should, still settled low enough some evenings to sting the eyes and catch in the back of the throat, though never again as badly as that first night. Nora had taken to sleeping close to the doorway on the worst evenings, which solved the immediate problem while creating a new one, since the doorway was also where cold air gathered thickest. On the third morning, Bess wandered off toward the back of the cave, the section Amos had deliberately left unwalled and untouched at Hollis Cray's warning, and refused to come when called. Amos found her digging at a narrow crack, low in the rock, no wider than a hand, tucked behind a shelf of stone he had walked past 12 times without much notice. He knelt beside her and felt it immediately, a steady thread of air moving through the crack, cool and constant, pulling inward rather than pushing out, the opposite direction from the air at the cave mouth. He spent the better part of that day tracing the crack with a candle flame, watching how the small fire bent and pulled toward the opening, even when no wind stirred outside at all. It was, he realized slowly, a natural chimney, a fissure running up through the rock itself to some unseen opening higher on the mountainside, pulling air steadily upward the way any proper flue does, drawing smoke and heat along with it. His wall had been fighting the mountain instead of working with it. The gap he built kept trying to force smoke out through stone that had never wanted to let it pass, while a few feet away, the mountain had already been offering a chimney of its own the entire time. That evening, he rebuilt the fire pit itself, moving it several feet closer to the natural crack, angling a low shelf of stone above it to help guide smoke toward the opening, rather than let it drift upward randomly into the cave's high ceiling. The fire that night burned clean. Smoke rose, thinned, and vanished into the crack in the rock, as though the mountain had been waiting the entire time for someone to notice what it already had to offer. Nora fell asleep within the hour, warm, breathing easily, one hand resting on Bess's back. The first real test came on the 8th day, not as the heavy snow everyone expected, but as a hard, driving rain that turned the slope outside the cave to running mud and hammered against the stone wall for the better part of a night. Amos had grown almost confident by then, confident enough that the storm's arrival caught him thinking more about the wall's strength against wind than about anything happening beneath his family's feet. It was Nora who noticed first, tugging at his sleeve well past midnight, pointing at the blanket beneath her, which had gone damp along one edge despite sitting well clear of any obvious leak. Amos ran a hand across the cave floor and found it cool and faintly slick, not wet exactly, but carrying a dampness that had not been there the night before. Stone, he understood, held cold the same patient way it held heat, and the ground beneath them, sitting directly against bare rock all these nights, had been slowly drawing warmth and moisture in equal measure, the difference simply too gradual to notice until a full night of rain pushed it further. He spent that stormy night working by lantern light, dragging in armfuls of dry bracken and pine boughs from beneath a rock overhang where he had stored firewood, layering it thick beneath their sleeping quilts, creating a rough barrier between the cold stone floor and their bodies. It was not an elegant solution, and he knew it, but by laying down enough dry material, he was doing for the floor roughly what the wall already did for the wind, giving the cold and damp something to work through before it ever reached them, rather than letting stone touch skin directly. By morning, the rain had passed. The wall stood without a single stone shifted, and the smoke crack continued drawing steadily as it had every night since Bess found it. But Amos sat outside as the sun rose, running the measuring stick between his hands, thinking less about the storm just past and more about the one still coming. Rain was inconvenience. What the valley called a blizzard, when it finally arrived, would be judgment. 4 days remained. The wall had held. The smoke had cleared. The floor, for now, had been patched rather than truly solved. Somewhere above the valley, the sky had already begun to change color in a way the old-timers would have recognized immediately. Hollis Cray rode up on the morning of the 9th day, not to warn Amos away this time, but to tell him plainly that the weather building over the ridge to the north was the kind he had only seen a handful of times in over 20 years on that mountain. "Wind's going to swing," Hollis said, studying the cave mouth with an expression that had shifted subtly from doubt to something closer to reluctant respect. "Right now, you're sheltered from the west. When this turns, it's going to come from the north instead, straight down that draw." Amos followed his gaze toward the narrow gap in the ridgeline above them, a natural funnel that had, until that moment, seemed like nothing more than scenery. He understood immediately what Hollis meant. The wall he had built, angled and battered as it was, had been shaped entirely around wind coming from the direction it had come from every day since they arrived. A shift in direction meant the wall's strongest bracing would suddenly be facing the wrong way entirely, exposed along an edge never built to take a direct hit. There was no time to rebuild the entire structure, not with the sky already darkening at its edges and the temperature dropping steadily through the afternoon. Instead, Amos worked through what remained of the daylight, reinforcing the northern edge of the wall specifically, stacking additional stone in a rough buttress against that one exposed corner, wedging smaller rocks into every gap he could find along the join between wall and rock face. Nora spent the afternoon inside, coughing again, softly but persistently, a sound that had returned 2 days earlier and refused to fully leave, despite the improvements to smoke and floor. Amos tried not to let his daughter see how closely he was watching her, how each small cough landed heavier on him than any warning Hollis had given about the storm itself. By evening, Hollis had ridden back down toward the valley, promising to check on them once the weather passed, if it passed the way weather usually did. Bess refused to settle, pacing near the doorway, long after dark, ears pinned back toward a sound of wind now audibly shifting direction somewhere above the ridge. Amos banked the fire carefully that night, checked the wall one final time, by lantern light and sat beside his daughter, listening to the first gusts of true winter wind finding their way, for the first time, down through that narrow draw exactly as Hollis had described. The storm arrived fully sometime after midnight, and it did not arrive gently. Wind came down through the northern draw exactly as Hollis had predicted, hitting the reinforced corner of the wall in long, shuddering gusts that Amos could feel through the stone itself when he pressed a hand against it. Snow followed within the hour, thick and driven nearly sideways, the kind of storm the Valley families had spent all autumn preparing for behind proper cabin walls and stocked woodsheds. Inside, the fire held, drawing steadily up through the natural crack Bess had found, filling the cave with a heat that had, over the preceding week, slowly worked its way into the stone itself, the way heat always does, given enough time and enough fire. The wall's largest stones, sitting closest to the flame each night, had been quietly absorbing warmth for days, and now, in the deepest hours of the storm, they gave a portion of it back, radiating gently, even in stretches when the fire burned low. It was not enough, on its own, to erase the cold entirely. Nora's cough had worsened through the evening, tight and frequent, and Amos found himself doing the arithmetic every parent eventually does in a storm like that one, weighing the risk of stepping outside for more firewood against the risk of letting the fire burn low enough to fail. Near what he guessed to be 3 a.m, a gust stronger than the rest struck the northern buttress directly, and Amos heard, unmistakably, the grinding shift of stone settling under new pressure. He was on his feet immediately, lantern in hand, checking the reinforced corner by weak yellow light, while wind screamed past the doorway canvas. 2 stones near the top had shifted, not fallen, but loosened enough that a thin line of driven snow had begun working through the gap. He packed it immediately with bracken and a folded section of canvas, weighing the makeshift patch down with whatever loose stone remained nearby, working with hands that had gone numb within minutes. Behind him, Nora's coughing had quieted, not because she had improved, but because exhaustion had finally pulled her into a restless sleep against Bess's side, the old dog pressed close against her the entire night without once being asked to. Amos sat back against the warm stone near the fire, watching the patched corner, listening to the wind test every seam in the wall he had built with his own hands in 9 days, and understood that morning would tell him everything the storm itself could not. Dawn broke pale and unusually still, the way it often does after the worst part of a storm has finally spent itself. Amos had not slept, though he had, at some point in the deepest hours, stopped expecting to. The wall stood. The patched corner held snow packed hard against the canvas, and bracken he had wedged into the gap sometime after 3 a.m, the reinforced stones beneath it settled but intact. Inside, the fire had burned low but steady through the entire night, the stone around it still holding enough warmth that the cave felt, by comparison to the world outside, almost gentle. Nora woke slowly, her cough noticeably softer. Color returned to her face in a way it had not carried the evening before, She sat up against Bess, looked toward the doorway where pale winter light was beginning to filter through gaps in the canvas, and asked her father, in the plain, unbothered way children ask enormous questions, whether the storm was over. It was, for now. Amos stepped outside into snow nearly to his knees, the slope below transformed into an unbroken white field, the valley beyond it quiet, in the particular way a landscape goes quiet after surviving something. Hollis Cray arrived by mid-morning, moving slowly through the drifts on snowshoes, expecting, by his own later account, to find very little left standing. What he found, instead, was smoke rising cleanly from a crack in the rock face, a wall that had bent under the storm's worst pressure without breaking, and a girl sitting in the cave mouth, wrapped in her mother's quilt, watching the valley with the unremarkable calm of a child who had simply survived a cold night rather than a miracle. Word moved through the valley faster than the snow had, and over the following days, more than a few of the same neighbors who had questioned Amos's judgment found reasons to ride up the slope and see the wall for themselves. Nobody mentioned the badger comment from the trading post. Nobody brought up the warnings shouted from a comfortable distance weeks earlier. They only stood near the doorway, studying the angled stone, the smoke drifting into rock, rather than a chimney anyone had built, the measuring stick still resting against the wall where Amos had left it the night before. Hollis Cray, standing longer than anyone else, finally spoke the only verdict that seemed to matter. Rocks held before, he said, didn't figure it'd hold like this. The mountain had not given Amos Ferris a home out of kindness. It had simply been waiting, the way patient things wait, for someone willing to measure it properly before asking it to be one. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.